Welcome to the Punic Wars, how Rome defeated its greatest enemy. This podcast will explore the three so-called Punic Wars that occurred between 264 and 146 BC, and will try to explain how they fundamentally changed the world. We are all aware of the power and influence of the great Roman Empire, but unbeknownst to most people, before Rome became this glorious empire, it had a rival to contend with. When Rome was an emerging city-state on the Italian peninsula, it had to compete with another Mediterranean power. Carthage, the most prominent city-state on the North African coast, which controlled most of the Western Mediterranean, posed a major threat to Roman expansion. The ensuing clash between these two powers led to some of history's most famous battles, and gave way to the rise of the Roman Empire. To better understand the Punic Wars, let's go back to the beginning of these civilizations. Let us begin with the foundation and rise of Rome. Unfortunately, there are little to no reliable accounts of the early days of Rome, and so we must rely on later writers, who in turn relied on mythology and oral tradition to tell the tale. According to traditional narrative, Rome's story began in 753 BC, when two brothers by the name of Romulus and Remus founded the city on hills overlooking the Tiber River in central Italy. After a fight in which he murdered Remus, Romulus became the sole king of Rome. Over time, the city was ruled by 7 kings. However, in 509 BC, after the reign of one cruel king and his perverted rapist son, the city revolted against their leaders and established a republic. The Roman Republic developed as a land-based militaristic society, who drew much of its societal and militaristic inspiration from its neighbors, the Etruscans. In the early 300s BC, the city of Rome was sacked by a Gallic tribe. Roman historian Livy dates the sack to around 390 BC, while Polybius, a Greco-Roman historian, thought that this occurred in 387 BC. But regardless, the sacking destroyed the early writings and documents of the Republic. So the narrative became less grounded in myth and more factual after the sacking of Rome. Through constant wars with its neighbors, the Romans eventually subdued most of the Italian peninsula. It was in this period, in the mid-300s BC, that the Romans encountered the Carthaginians, with whom they established trade relations and peace treaties. Rome established a presence in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, and, in 280 BC, found itself at war with a Greek king by the name of Pyrrhus, who presented the Romans with a unique challenge and defeated them multiple times in battle. Rome eventually proved to be resilient, and Pyrrhus took his forces to Sicily to fight Carthage, hoping to find better luck in conquest there. He saw some success, but went back to Italy, where he was defeated and forced to the Greek mainland, where he was eventually killed by having a roof towel thrown at him by an old lady. During these Pyrrhic Wars, the Carthaginians and Romans renewed their treaties. Despite the two cities maintaining friendly relations, there was always a level of distrust between them. The Romans often refused Carthaginian aid, and both sides wanted control over Sicily. But before we can get into what happened next, we have to rewind the clock 1,000 years back and understand the Carthaginian point of view. Phoenicia, which is located in modern-day Lebanon and northern Israel, was a region dominated by a group of ancient naval traders who shared a similar culture and religion. However, they lived in separate city-states. As early as 5,000 years ago, Phoenician sailors began exploring the Mediterranean. At first, they mostly served to trade with neighboring nations on behalf of their king. This trading allowed them to resist expansionist Bronze Age powers who sought to benefit from the trade. However, after the Bronze Age collapse, the countries around Phoenicia had disappeared, so without the state-sponsored trading, the merchants were now able to trade for their own profit rather than that of their king. They became exceptional traders and brought in immense wealth to the region, mostly luxury goods, but also tools and metals were brought into the Phoenician city-states. As the Near East began to recover from the Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenicians once again were under pressure from their neighbors. As a result of this pressure to bring in wealth, Tyre, the leading Phoenician city-state, began to set up profitable colonies in Cyprus and Sicily, which were loyal to the king. But as they further explored the Western Mediterranean, that's where the myth of Carthage began. The story of the foundation of Carthage was thought to have originated from Greece, but the most well-known version today was written by the Romans. The myth states that in 814 BC, the queen of Tyre, Dido, fled the country after her brother murdered her husband for power and wealth. She landed in North Africa, near modern-day Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, and negotiated with the locals to get however much land could be fit in the hide of an ox. Cleverly though, she cut the ox into tiny strips and laid them out to encircle a large plot of land. It was here that Carthage was founded. So, I mentioned earlier that Carthage first met with the Romans in the mid-300s BC. However, Roman myth tells a completely different story. Many Romans considered themselves to have descended from the ancient Trojans. They believed that the Trojan hero Aeneas had led an expedition and landed in central Italy, where his descendants would eventually found Rome. According to the myth, Aeneas made a stop at Carthage and fell in love with Queen Dido. He prioritized his people and eventually left her to settle in Italy. Dido became enraged and cursed their descendants to eternal rivalry, foreshadowing the wars to come, and killing herself, burning all of Aeneas' leftover belongings with her. This story wasn't written until long after the fall of Carthage, and although we know that the city would have been founded around this time, we don't know the specific details, and we never will. We do know, however, that over time, other settlers helped build up the city, and due to its strategic position, it became a regional trading hub. Over the centuries, Carthage subdued its neighbors and began bringing in immense wealth through trade. The city also maintained a strong agricultural presence on land, as we know from the material record and from the wealth of knowledge derived from Carthaginian text. The colony of Carthage set up colonies of itself in North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and parts of eastern Spain, and the Balearic Islands. As Carthage became shrouded in prosperity, its home colony Tyre fell to the expanding Persian Empire, and the old Phoenician cities experienced a dramatic decline. Like their Phoenician ancestors, the Carthaginians were exceptionally good at maritime trade, and they were also experts at naval warfare. By the 4th century BC, they had mastered the seas. The Carthaginians took a particular interest in Sicily, where the Greeks had also established colonies. The Greek Syracusans and the Carthaginians often came into conflict over control of the island, and it was in Sicily where the Carthaginians and the Romans would first begin to have conflicting interests. Okay. As we noted earlier, the Carthaginians and the Romans initially had friendly relations, but there was still a level of distrust amongst the two regional powers. After Rome had defeated Pyrrhus and taken control over all of the Italian peninsula, it became worried about Carthaginian expansion. The Romans looked south at Sicily and saw the Carthaginians as a threat. Carthage was building up its presence throughout the Mediterranean, and the two regional powers would inevitably collide with one another. The tipping point occurred when a group of Sicilian mercenaries, known as the Mamertines, took control over the city of Messana. They were under pressure from the king of Syracuse, and so they sent pleas to help for both the Romans and Carthaginians. The Carthaginians reached the city first and occupied it. The Romans were initially hesitant to send forces into Sicily. However, the Senate saw an opportunity to gain a foothold on the island and sent out a Roman force, leading to a confrontation between the two powers. The Romans and Carthaginians both had humble origins and started as small city-states. They both subdued their neighbors and became immensely wealthy and powerful. Initially on friendly terms, the two nations eventually became bitter rivals, and one city in Sicily would draw them into a war which would forever change the fate of Western history. In the next episode, we will look at the first conflict and confrontation between Rome and Carthage, and we'll discuss how the outcome had consequences which led to further conflict within a mere generation.